Have you ever noticed that there are no demons in the Old Testament? Well, not at least how they show up in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you get the snake in the garden and the sons of God in Genesis 6. You also get a handful of Hebrew words that scholars argue about, words like Shadim and Azazel and Seirim, but nothing that looks like what you see in the Gospels. There's no possessions and no exorcisms, no beings who speak and negotiate and beg and identify Jesus by name before his own disciples fully understand who he is. The Old Testament seems almost one dimensional. There's God and there's humans, and there's a few angels, but it seems like there's not much else. Then the Gospels open, and the spirit world is suddenly everywhere. From the first chapter of Mark, every step Jesus takes into public life draws a response from the spirit world. They're living inside people and screaming in synagogues and driving a man to mutilate himself in a graveyard. They know who Jesus is, and they're terrified of what his arrival means. And then the disciples start casting them out, and Paul writes letters to churches about principalities and powers and rulers of darkness operating over entire regions. The whole landscape of the New Testament assumes a detailed, functional demonology that the Old Testament seems to barely hint at. That gap has been a source of confusion for a lot of people who don't really understand the difference in spirituality and specifically demonic activity between the Old and the New Testaments. So, where does that difference come from between the two testaments? Well, the Skeptics says that it's just a literary invention. The Jewish writers in the New Testament picked up ideas from the Babylonian exile and from Persian dualism and from the Hellenistic world. And by the first century, those ideas had worked their way into popular religion. They say that what you're reading in the Gospels isn't actually revelation, it's a cultural accumulation. To them, that means demons aren't real beings with coherent original story. They're mythology that the New Testament writers inherited and they didn't bother to correct. That answer is simple and it sounds sophisticated from an academic perspective, but it doesn't actually hold up to the test of the text itself. On the other hand, the believer's standard isn't much better either. They usually point to fallen angels. They say that Satan rebelled and took a third of the angels with him, which is true. And those fallen angels are what we call demons, which is where it begins to be a little bit of a stretch. It is tidy and it's been taught in Sunday school for generations. But the problem is that it doesn't explain anything the New Testament actually is showing you. It doesn't answer questions like, why do demons seek bodies? We know that fallen angels don't need bodies. They are already spirit beings, and they've shown that they have the ability to manifest themselves in physical form in the Old Testament. Why do they roam dry places as if they're going mad? Why do they beg not to be sent to the abyss before their time or out of the country where they're dwelling? Why does Legion, an entire army of them, negotiate with Jesus about where they're allowed to go? If demons are just fallen angels, none of that behavior makes sense. Both answers, the secular academic and the traditional Christian answer, fail when they're lined up against the text. One of them dismisses it as myth, and the other flattens it into a comfortable category that doesn't fit the text. So here's what I'm going to do with this video. I'm going to show you that the Bible actually has a coherent, traceable demonology rooted in the Hebrew text itself, and it's not imported from outside cultures. I'll show you that there's not one, but three distinct categories of hostile spiritual beings, each with a different origin and a different current status and a different appointed fate. And I'll show you that the explosion of demonic confrontation in the Gospels isn't random, and it's not just the result of people suddenly paying closer attention. It's the expected result of what Jesus came to do. His mission goes to the nations, and the nations are occupied territory. There are powers that have held that ground for a long time, and they know exactly what his arrival means for them. Before we get too deep into this video about demonology in the Old Testament and the New Testament, I have to tell you that I just released a book. So if you're into biblical history or biblical archaeology, I encourage you to check it out. It's Dynasty of Slaves. And I finally have an actual copy to show you instead of putting a picture on the screen. I've been talking about it for a while. If you already have it, thank you so much for picking it up. Go ahead and do your best to remember to go back and leave a review. That's really helpful for me. If you haven't picked it up, go search Dynasty of Slaves on Amazon or just click the link in the description under the video. I think you'll like it. It's the uncovering of archaeological evidence for Israel in Egypt. So I walk through from Genesis 12 all the way through the Exodus, showing where there's evidence of Israel in Egypt during that period. Go ahead and check it out. Back to our study on demonology between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we need to start with the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. Because what we find there, what happens in that period, shapes everything about how we understand the New Testament writers. Most Christians treat the intertestamental period like a silent waiting period. Nothing canonical is being written, so nothing important is happening. I think that's a pretty big mistake. The Jewish people during this period are not sitting still theologically. They're reading their own scriptures with intense focus. They're wrestling with questions the text raises but doesn't always fully answer. There are questions about the spirit world and about what happened in Genesis 6, about the origin of evil, the nature of hostile spiritual beings, and what God intends to do about all of it. And out of that wrestling comes a body of literature that becomes the shared cosmological vocabulary of first century Judaism. It's the water they swim in, you could think of. The most important piece of that literature for our purposes is First Enoch, specifically the sections known as the Book of Watchers. I'm not saying that's the most important book of that period. I'm just saying for our conversation today. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Enoch isn't in my Bible. And you're right, it probably isn't unless you have an Ethiopian Bible. But multiple copies of First Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means it wasn't a fringe text sitting on the margins of Jewish thought. It was being copied and studied and circulated by people who study their scriptures and take them seriously. And the New Testament itself treats it as authoritative tradition, even if it doesn't necessarily canonize it. Jude quotes it directly, not just an allusion, not just a reference. It's an actual quote. That alone is enough reason to understand that it's an important book to the apostles. What it says is that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were watchers, divine beings who crossed the boundary between heavenly and earthly realms. They took human women and produced offspring called the Nephilim. And that those Nephilim, when they died, left something behind. They are disembodied spirits, beings that were part divine and part human with no proper place in either realm and no body to inhabit. So they're wandering and they're seeking. We even see some of this language when Jesus speaks. By the time Jesus arrives, this is widely assumed background. It's what educated Jews believed when they heard the word demon. It's what the disciples understood, and it's what the crowds understood. Jesus never stops to explain the demonology because it doesn't need to. His audience already has this framework in their mind during his sermons. The Gospels are written for people who already know this. We're reading them from the outside looking in, and most of us have never been handed the key that the first century Jews had. So let's take a second to build that framework. Let's see if we can find that key. There are 3 tiers, 3 origins, 3 current statuses, and 3 fates. Once you see these 3 clearly, the New Testament snaps into focus, or at least the demonology of the New Testament does. Tier 1, we're going to look at the Watchers. We're going to start with Genesis 6. This is a summary of what happens there. The sons of God see the daughters of men, they take them as wives, and the Nephilim are born. If you've watched the Seed War video that I did a couple of months ago, you know the full picture. And so if you're confused, I'd say maybe pause here, go back and watch that video, and then come back here. For our purposes in this moment, what matters is what happens immediately after that. The Watchers who cross that boundary are imprisoned. They're not destroyed and they're not roaming the earth. They're imprisoned in a specific place. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 says that God spared not the angels that sinned, but he cast them down to Tartarus and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. Jude 6 says, the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, are reserved in everlasting change under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. This is specifically the ones who willfully left heaven to come to earth for some specific purpose. These are not the angels who are cast out of heaven. That's very important to understand the difference between those things. These beings are not active, though. They are bound and waiting a verdict that has already been pronounced, but is not yet fully executed. Their imprisonment is the direct consequence of Genesis 6. It's permanent until the judgment day. And then you have tier 2, the Nephilim spirits. The Nephilim are the offspring of those unions in Genesis 6. They're hybrid beings. You'd say they were part divine or part spirit and part human. They live, they die in the flood and later in the conquest. And when they die, something happens that doesn't happen when ordinary humans die. Their spirits are not at rest. The Book of Watchers is explicit about this. Because they're not fully human, their spirits do not go where human spirits go. They're displaced. They're disembodied. They wander. They seek embodiment because embodiment is the only existence they've ever known. This is why demons in the Gospels seek bodies. This is why they roam to dry places, as Jesus says. This is why Legion negotiates about where they're allowed to go rather than simply leaving. These aren't angel-class beings operating in their native mode. We would say that angel-class beings operating in their native mode are not subject to regions. These are spirits of dead hybrid beings doing exactly what the Second Temple tradition said they would do. The Rephaim pipeline connects here. That word in Hebrew carries two distinct usages that most English readers never see. It refers to a specific population of giant clans in Canaan, and it refers to the shades of the dead in Sheol. Isaiah 14, Psalm 88, Proverbs 9. The overlap is not accidental in these situations. It's the same category of being before and after death. If you want the full treatment of that thread, the Rephaim video covers it in detail back from December, one of my older videos. Then there's tier 3, the Deuteronomy 32 princes. This tier is different, and the difference here matters. There's confusion about the difference between the Nephilim and the princes of Deuteronomy 32, and so I want to take a moment to talk about that. We're going to go to Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. When the Most High divided the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. But the Dead Sea Scrolls text say something different. It also echoes the Septuagint. They both read the sons of God there rather than the children of Israel. And that reading explains everything that follows in the biblical narrative about the gods of the nations. At Babel, God allotted the nations to the divine beings. Those beings were given jurisdiction, and Psalm 82 tells you what they did with it. They judged unjustly, it says. They accepted the worship that belonged to God alone. And in Psalm 82, it pronounces their sentence. It says, "Nevertheless, ye shall die like men, and fall like one of the princes." These beings are not bound. They are currently active. They are the principalities and the powers that Paul writes about in Ephesians chapter 6. They are the rulers of this age. Their sin is different from the Watchers. Their timeline is different. They weren't imprisoned after Genesis 6 because their offense came later, and their role in the allotment structure was part of God's own design, even if they corrupted it. Satan sits across all three tiers as a distinct figure. This Satan figure, not the general adversary, but Satan himself, the serpent, the deceiver. Still with access, as Job 1 and 2 show us clearly, still the accuser, condemned but not yet confined. Revelation 12 tells you his time is short and he knows it. I did a video about that right before Christmas in December 2025. So if you're curious about what Revelation 12 says about Satan, go check out that video and then come back here. He's not a fallen watcher. He's not a Nephilim spirit. He is the adversary, operating in a legal capacity that hasn't fully closed yet. So there it is, 3 tiers, 3 origins, 3 current statuses, and 3 different fates. Well, they all end up in the same place, but they get there different ways. The conflation of all 3 into one bucket by labeling them as fallen angels has cost the church an enormous amount of clarity about what the New Testament is actually describing when it comes to demonology. Now go back to the Gospels and read them with everything that we've just built underneath it. If you've watched my video on Mark chapter 5 about the cosmological map, then you have a better picture of what's going on here. In Mark 5, there is Legion, the Abyss, the Swine, the Decapolis. Now, I'm not going to repeat all of that. What we are going to do is look at the pattern across multiple encounters, because the pattern is what proves the framework isn't being retrofitted into one convenient story. It's a framework that runs through all of them. We're going to start with Mark chapter 1, all the way at the beginning, the first chapter written about Jesus. Jesus walks into the synagogue at Capernaum, and immediately a man with an unclean spirit cries out. And what does that spirit say? It says, "Let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to destroy us? I know thee who thou art, the Holy One of God." This is the first public act of Jesus' ministry, not a sermon, not a healing. It's an immediate confrontation with a being that recognizes him on sight, and he knows exactly what his presence means. The Spirit doesn't ask who Jesus is because it already knows. It's the same thing that happens in Mark chapter 5, just a few chapters later. What it wants to know is whether destruction is happening now or at some other time. That's not the behavior of a fallen angel operating in its native spiritual mode. That's a behavior of a displaced being with eschatological awareness, a being that knows the timeline and is terrified that its appointed moment has actually arrived ahead of schedule. Matthew 12 gives you the mute and blind demoniac. And what matters here isn't just the exorcism, it's what Jesus says immediately after it. He goes straight into the strong man, saying, "How can one enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods except the first bind the strong man?" Jesus isn't stopping to give us a parable. He's not speaking abstractly or using allegory. He's describing what his mission is doing in real time. Every demon cast out is evidence the strong man is being bound, that enemy-held territory is being reclaimed. Mark 7 takes Jesus into Syrophoenician territory, Gentile ground, and a woman comes to him about her daughter who has an unclean spirit. Now pay attention to where you are on the map. This is Deuteronomy 32 geography, current day Lebanon. This is allotted territory to the enemy, to the nations. The confrontation isn't incidental to the location, though. Jesus is operating in the jurisdiction of the Deuteronomy 32 princes, and his presence there is itself the confrontation. The daughter is freed from a distance. Jesus never has to look at her to set her free from the demon. And I think that's worth paying attention to. The power operating in that territory has no ability to resist him, even when he isn't physically present in the room. And then on to Mark chapter 9, it gives you the boy with the convulsing spirit. And this one is notable for a different reason. The disciples couldn't cast it out themselves. Jesus casts it out and then tells them afterward that this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. There are distinctions within the category. Not all demonic encounters are the same. Not all of them yield the same approach. The framework has internal complexity, even though it looks like it's simple from the outside, and the text is not trying to flatten it. Now look at the pattern across all of those stories. Demons consistently identify Jesus correctly before his own disciples do. They consistently fear judgment. They consistently negotiate around their appointed fate rather than simply submitting to it. They seek embodiment. They know the timeline. They operate with a legal awareness of what they are and are not permitted to do. None of that behavior makes sense if demons are just fallen angels doing vague spiritual mischief. All of it makes perfect sense if they are what the Second Temple tradition said they were: displaced spirits of dead hybrid beings operating in a world where the one person who has authority to end their current existence has just walked into it. They knew what his arrival meant before almost anyone else did. And that recognition, that sense of terror and fear in their voice when talking to Jesus, is woven through every encounter from the first chapter of Mark to the last exorcism in the Gospels. Now, everything that I've just walked through in the Gospels, Paul is applying to the present mission of the church in his letters. Some people think that Paul was developing a new theology of the spirit world in his epistles, but that's not what he's doing at all. He's working from the same framework that Jesus is operating in and drawing out its implications for churches planted in Gentile territory. He's taking Jesus' unique mission to Israel and translating it for his own mission to the nations. Deuteronomy 32 territory, that's where Paul was sent. Enemy held ground. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness in this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." That list is the reality that we face. It's principalities and powers in the technical vocabulary. It's the context of Deuteronomy 32 allotment structure. These are the beings who have held jurisdiction over the nations since Babel. Paul is telling churches in the middle of that territory that the opposition they're facing has a real, structured, hierarchical source, and that they need to understand what they're up against. Colossians chapter 2, verse 15 says, "Having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it." The cross was about human sin, but it was more than just that. It publicly humiliated the powers that had held the nations in bondage. The word Paul uses for triumphing is the language of a Roman military procession, a conqueror parading his defeated enemies through the streets. That's what the cross did to the principalities. Their authority was stripped, their claim was broken. They're still operating, but they're operating as a defeated army that hasn't fully vacated the field yet. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 8 tells us something remarkable about how that defeat happened. None of the princes of this world knew what the cross would accomplish. Had they known, Paul says, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. They engineered their own defeat in a way. They thought their crucifixion was their victory, and it was the instrument of their undoing. 1 Corinthians 10:20 closes the loop on the Deuteronomy 32 structure directly. The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. The gods behind the idols are real beings. They're not figments of imagination. The worship is real worship being directed to real entities. He's telling the Corinthian church that the religious landscape of the Gentile world is the Deuteronomy 32 allotment structure still operating, and that participating in it is a live spiritual danger. Paul is applying a coherent, inherited framework to the present reality of churches living and witnessing in the middle of territory that has been under hostile jurisdiction since Babel. And the cross is the event that changed the legal status of that jurisdiction permanently, even if the full eviction is still in the future. All three tiers are defeated at the cross, none of them fully removed yet. And that tension is not a problem with the framework. The strong man is bound, the house is being plundered, but the final removal is still future. And the church is the instrument of that plundering, carrying the gospel into territory that has been under hostile jurisdiction since Babel, doing exactly what Jesus was doing in Decapolis, in Syrophoenician territory, in every Gentile region he walked into deliberately. Now, as a pastor, here's what I want you to understand from this story. It's not just academic. It's not just theoretical. The greatest tactical advantage of a real enemy is convincing you that he doesn't exist. A defeated army that can make you forget it's an army operates with an effectiveness completely disproportionate to its actual remaining power. The Western church has largely handed that advantage over freely. We have spiritualized the language of Ephesians 6 into a metaphor. We've reduced its principalities and powers to vague cultural forces. And we treated the demonic possession as a first century phenomenon that modernity has moved beyond. And in doing so, we have gone into genuinely contested territory without a map, without situational awareness, and without taking seriously what Paul told those churches in Ephesus and Corinth about what they were actually dealing with. But here is what is also true. You are not fighting for a victory that hasn't happened yet. The strong man is already bound. The principalities are already disarmed and publicly humiliated. Every hostile being you ever encounter operates under a judgment that was declared before you were born and will be executed on a timetable that is not theirs to control. The outcome has never been in doubt. In other words, you're not fighting for victory, you're fighting from victory. Let me give you a quick homework assignment from a pastor. Go read Mark 5 and Ephesians 6 this week. Read them with everything that you now know underneath them. I would bet you that you're not going to read it the same way again.